My talk today is on the W3C's new the accessibility roles and responsibilities mapping. And this is an effort to try and take the WK guidelines and break it into something that is easier to apply, something that can be applied earlier in the process, and something that also takes the pressure off of a an accessibility expert to be able to deliver it. So just to put some context around this so that people have a sense of what accessibility is, why it matters, and why this matters right now, especially here in Europe. I tend to think about, I've got pictures here in the side that are completely unrelated to the talk, but are just taken from my Bird Buddy, which is a camera that takes pictures when the birds come to my bird feeder. So this is a red cardinal that's looking curiously at the camera, and there will be other birds like that come along through the slides. I tend to break down accessibility in terms of atoms and bits. And there's the built environment. There's things like ramps and access for wheelchairs. The seating here, for example, which is really great. There's things like captions, which are generally for people who may have hearing disabilities and may not be able to hear the message. But there's if you try and think about the digital technologies in the digital universe, those are substantially different than wheelchairs, for example, which are so often used as part of the understanding of accessibility. But there's a whole range of different products that are affecting people with like ways that digital affects people with disabilities, and we don't necessarily think about them, but if you have, again, 1 in 5 people with disabilities, you're dealing with visual disabilities, hearing or audio disabilities. You have issues with mobility. You have issues with cognitive disabilities. Like there's a range of, like, all of our senses and all of our capacities are things that can be different. We're all very different in this world. So there's it's an interesting sort of structure of, like, how do you try and understand who's going to be limited, and many of the people who have disabilities are also people who they're invisible disabilities. We don't actually notice who are those people who have those disabilities. But the biggest sort of, in terms of web accessibility or digital accessibility, the biggest set of guidelines is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And these break down the success criteria into perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So there's a framework to try and understand how those success criteria are put together. There's also a range of legislation. You'll have heard most likely about the European Accessibility Act. Previously, there was the Web Accessibility Directive. In the United States, there's Section 508. And these are things that have implications for how we assess digital accessibility, and it's not just for the web. These are technologies that apply to elevators, that apply to kiosks, that apply to a range of other digital technologies. There's also trying to think about how, for both EN 301, 549, and Section 508, there's a breakdown for the type of criteria, the type of disability that's associated with it, and what are the success criteria that fall under different types of specifications, like trying to understand who is affected by these success criteria. The Web Accessibility Initiative is the group within the World Wide Web Consortium that manages the evaluation. This is the standards body that works together to provide a agreement on how we are going to go off and define whether something passes or fails. Because with all of this legislation, there is both the intent to be a carrot and a stick, so that you can promote those organizations that are are implementing good accessibility, and you can make sure that they get the contracts, and you can go off and provide either fines or bring those organizations that have bad accessibility. You can provide opportunities for them to have financial costs or other repercussions for not meeting the needs of people with disabilities. And yeah, WCAG is the central reference for all of this legislation because it is the most well-used and referred to standard. And we're right now at WCAG 2.2 is the latest release. They're working on WCAG 3, but that was going to take a long while to go off and to get implemented. There will probably be a WCAG 2.3. In Europe, the EN 301549 standard is currently pegged to 2.1, but it will be pegged to 2.2 in the next release, we believe. And it's something that does take some time to go off and review to make sure that it applies as part of a European standard. So that's sort of how it works in terms of the regulations. Now, ARRM, this accessibility roles and responsibilities mapping, isn't unique in the world. There are other efforts who have tried to go off and to take these guidelines and break them down to say, well, who's responsible for this? How do we try and create a checklist for designers that applies so that they know what to do? For front-end people, how do we summarize this for our audience to make sure that we're the ones that we know what our teams need to do in order to go off and to make accessibility work for us? What's unique about ARRM is that we tried specifically, and this is led by Denis Boudreau and Bill Tyler, who tried to, for much of the last decade, work on defining looking at the WCAG success criteria and ripping those apart and trying to understand how those success criteria are understood by regular people or by individual roles. So it's trying to take the language of WCAG, which is frankly something that was developed by a committee over a number of years. Like how many people here have read WCAG? I should start with that. So we've got one person, aside from my two people here in this room, who've read WCAG. And would you describe it as a good read? Is it compelling? Does it put you to sleep? Is it hard to understand? Yes, yes, yes. It is, again, writing standards is hard, and writing standards by committee is inevitably how it happens. And WCAG sadly does not have a consistent editor, so even the voice and the instructions and the commands, the requirements vary per success criterion. So it's difficult to try and understand how to manage this, but or how to understand how you implement all these success criteria. But what what this group did that is now a WC3 community group. What we've been doing over the last decade is trying to say, how does success criteria 1.1.1 apply to all the different roles, and trying to define, well, what are the roles that are involved in digital? Because that's something that hasn't really been defined and clearly understood. And in fact, it's different depending on where you are. There's different kinds of ways that teams are split up, whether you're in Europe or North America, whether you're involved in different parts of the web industry. If you're in e-commerce, it might be slightly different than if you're in government tech. So you're going to have different kinds of roles and different kinds of responsibilities depending on this. And so trying to figure out what are the teams and how you split up responsibilities is a challenge. So we dissected WCAG, and that's a little bit controversial because we didn't want to actually reinterpret WCAG because, again, the standards and the documentation around, like the exact wording, where the comma fits within the success criteria, like there is in some cases decades of debate that has gone on mailing lists and in IRC and on other spaces to try and figure out like exactly how in conferences, like how should this be exactly phrased in order to go off and to regulate so that it can be verified by the courts, so it can meet international recognition, so it can be supported by by all the companies that are involved in delivering the web, whether that's the Microsofts of the world or the Mozillas, like there's a whole range of people who are involved in creating this. There's the web accessibility experts. There's a number of agencies that have roles, and we don't want to reinterpret the WCAG guidelines, but we did need to pull them apart and reinterpret them so that we could understand exactly what are the tasks that we can assign to particular roles. Now we did just look at WCAG 2.1 because WCAG 2.2 came out beforehand, and this is, again, it's a long, arduous process to go off and to look at these and debate and discuss this. And so we haven't gotten to implementing WCAG 2.2 yet. That is something that we're working on. But we wanted to go off and provide a refactoring of them that allowed us to say, to break this into different groups. We also wanted to be able to shift responsibilities so that, so we're shifting left. People here heard about the concept of shift left? Okay, so the view is that so many industries go off and leave accessibility to the end. And they call in an accessibility person and they say, okay, well, we've got a week before this thing launches. Can you just give it a good review and and give it a check mark to say it's okay? I was like, no, that's not going to work. It's much like, if you try and make a blueberry muffin, but you want to add the blueberries in after it's already come out of the oven, like it's going to be a mess. But it's also like you wouldn't tell a security person that they have a week before the project launches to go off and to review and evaluate stuff in the last sprint, and that they you have to build it into the process. And so this is part of an effort to try and say, if we build in these ideas into individual roles for our digital teams for the projects we're working on, then we're going to be able to see that as in every sprint, that accessibility is going to be able to be factored in by the teams that are building these components before it gets released and before an accessibility specialist is brought in to review anything. Now, it's useful to have accessibility people along the way, and to involve them in the process, but they should not be the only ones who are responsible for making sure accessibility is being built, because quality is something that everyone is responsible for. So there's a number of different tasks that we try and break down. There's looking at the WCAG success criteria and, again, breaking it down so people can understand how it's implemented and what these things apply to. There's images and graphs. There's the semantic structure. There's input modalities. There's again navigation, data tables. We've ripped apart the success criteria so you can see what are the things that relate to forms. What are those success criteria, and how do you if you're building a web form, you can see exactly what are the kinds of things that you need to do for that. If you're looking at adding dynamic content, you can again see the list of tasks that are tied to that. So you can zip down to a particular piece of WCAG to say what are the roles we need to address for that. And that makes it much easier to be able to try and build out and to evaluate it based on the kind of form you're looking at, or the kind of interaction. And by the way, this bird here. This was not blown up or widened. This is one fat song sparrow, I think. So that is an tampered image. So we also tried to break it down in terms of roles. So thinking that some of these decisions cannot be decided by one particular role. Some of these accessibility issues are complicated enough that there may be 2 or 3 different roles that actually need to make the decision about what is the best practice or what should be evaluated for this. So first of all, we needed to define the roles for our process, and then we needed to look at how we fit those into a larger set of business roles. So again, you've got user experience, user research, user design, visual design. Like that's one bucket of skills. The business analysis, the product management, governance. These are all. Sometimes you're going to have decisions that fit somewhere somewhere between these disciplines, and in a lot of accessibility issues, there's finger pointing, because who is responsible? The visual design people want to point to the content people, who want to point to the front end people, and if you can't decide how decisions are going to be made, they're not going to be made, or they're going to be made by one group. That is going to just simply overpower or not consider the input of others, and others that should be considered or at least consulted. I've gone through and walked these. Like, for any questions so far? Does this kind of make some sense? Okay, it's the right answer. So this is an example of how we've split apart the different success criteria. So. We've got one here that's IMG 002 and IMG 008 and IMG 010. So those are, this is about images and alt text, and trying to provide, for every non-textual reference, you should have a textual alternative, so that you can always provide something, so that any kind of, whether it's a video, whether it's an image, whether it's like anything that's visual should have, or anything that is non-textual needs to have a textual alternative. But that has different implications for people. So the first one is informative images are described with a clear and meaningful alt text. Like that's something you can understand and sort of deal with. But it's also important to say that the purpose and function of complex images is accurately described in the text. And there's different ways to do that, but these are, this is all still one success criteria, but we've split it apart so that we've taken that complex language that's been agreed to by the W3C and said, okay, well, this is the kind of things that applies specifically to content authors that they need to be keeping in mind. The IMG 101 is that a full explanation of complex images is accurately described in the text. So again, these are just different ways of thinking about the roles and the kinds of tasks that people need to be doing when they're thinking about this. You can also see that there's the prefix to these numbers. So IMG is for image, SEM is for semantic, and if we go to the next one, we can see INP is for input, FRM is for form, and again, we've looked at different success criteria that apply to user experience design. And in fact, I've also just to highlight that we've on the ARRM website, which I don't think I've actually linked to in the slides, but you can search for this, and it's on the WC3 website. These are the top 5 issues of the top 15 things that our committee has decided are things that apply to each individual role. There are more items that are available for these different roles, but we wanted to be able to highlight on the web 15 of them, and for the purposes of this presentation, I wanted to highlight the top 5. And this may be different for your team. Like, there may be that as your team is looking at these criteria, you might want to, that you would look at different, like if you're Netflix, for example, and you're dealing with issues and concerns that Netflix has, I imagine that the amount of detail that you would have about how to provide video text for your described audio or your captioning would be more detailed and more complicated, because there's more people involved in that. You would have a more nuanced description of how you'd want to deal with that. Or if you're looking at building a site that has a lot of user experience design, you might want to flesh this out and have a broader definitions of this for your team. But we wanted to provide a starting point that allowed for people to look at and evaluate the different components, to make sure that there's understandings about this, and again, priority, like this is here as an example, not as something that you must follow, but I think a lot of people are looking for a starting point, and we want to build a process that people can hopefully find useful, and then iterate to find what is meaningful for your teams. Again, issues with the visual designers. We've got images, inputs, form elements, and there are going to be different challenges for for the visual designers, especially looking at charts and graphs. Then for the content designers, even though it's all part of WCAG 1.1.1. There's also the AAA requirements, which are included in this, but are not generally part of our priority list, because those are generally things that impact less people. The AAA requirements are something that are either harder to evaluate or something that affect a smaller portion of the population. Any questions about how this is laid out? I don't want to read the slides because they're boring, but it's it's just there to give you a sense of how these are constructed. And besides, it's good to have examples of grumpy cardinals, which this one certainly is. I don't know what it doesn't like, but it certainly is a grumpy bird. I think this you can see where the angry bird was sort of modeled after the cardinal. I think there, like that red little angry bird. And then this happens from time to time. So again, we've got for the front-end developers, so much of them is about their responsibilities are structuring semantic content. How do we make sure that everything isn't just in divs, that you're able to provide those semantic relationships so that people can understand how their content is matching up with the meaning of that text. Semantics is all about providing providing more meaning to the HTML, so that you're providing that additional context that can make whether it's somebody who's using a screen reader or other assistive technology, or for that matter any machine learning tool, to be able to understand this is the relationship and the importance of the text that's involved in it. And again, there's different elements that are involved for the various different groups. So these are still draft. We definitely want to have more input on them, and we've been discussing this and exploring this primarily as accessibility experts who have a particular perspective on this. And accessibility is not listed as in one of these roles, because it's responsible for all of the success criteria. There is a responsibility to be able to provide an overview, to provide a context, to be able to help answer questions and be able to be like a subject matter expert on all of these issues. So that's why the accessibility role is not included. The project management role is also really quite important, because in so many of these teams, if the project manager isn't on board, then the accessibility issues just get pushed back further in the backlog. It takes a project manager to go off and to talk with a client, whoever that client is, whether it's external or internal, to help them understand how accessibility is important, and how this is something that is not only helping them go and meet their requirements by the law and meet the ethical requirements of serving citizens with disabilities, but also looking at the ability to go off and just attract more customers. I mean, if you're talking about 1/5 of the population, that's a whole lot of people to write off, because it's inconvenient to deal with accessibility right now. I mean, I don't know any business that if you said, okay, we're going to go off and write off 1/5 of your customers, are you okay with that? No, like that's not acceptable, and it's even more so for governments, where there isn't the option to switch to a more accessible option. Most people are not simply allowed to go off and say, well, we know the UK has been doing some great work on accessibility. Let's move there, because I'll be able to get my services I will get better services as a citizen from the UK than I will from Canada. I'm not saying that that's legit, but that as an example, like, we don't have the ability to move as citizens. So you have to be able to serve all of the needs of the citizens. Education institutions, it's the same thing. We have to be able to strive to meet the needs of all of our citizens when we're building digital tools. And yeah, as I say here, the accessibility roles also have a huge coaching function. We don't assume people are not taught about accessibility when they're learning to be a designer or to be a front-end engineer. That's something that is not generally included in the courses that people are taking. yeah, an interesting challenge to try and figure out how to go off and to bring in how to include accessibility in the life cycle of the project, and to make sure that the non-technical roles and the non-accessibility leadership roles understand that there's importance for including it in the process, and that it is something that has to be considered even before the process. Like, you want people to be thinking about accessibility before the product is even being built. So how do we shift left so that people are thinking about it early and often? This is not a very readable graph. I'm not going to try and make this accessible because it's just a simple visualization to be able to say you've got content authors, you've got user experience, you've got the front-end accessibility, visual design, and business, the various different roles that I have just described earlier, but trying to sort of tie in how those success criteria across the perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust frameworks of WCAG, how do we try and make sure that those are things that are divided up, and see how it's distributed across that, how the responsibilities are distributed across the chart there. So it was just a way to try and to help make it more a visual representation of this. I've already mentioned that we wanted to try and make this as a model. We wanted to be able to provide an example, but there's a whole decision tree process that the ARRM committee has done, and that we're encouraging others to try and take on, to say, we want you to go off and to look at this process and look at your issues and say, what are the accessibility issues that you're dealing with now, that your teams are dealing with now, and how do you deal with accessibility, with the challenges inside those issues? And can you try and look at dividing those up and seeing where are there issues in your issue queue where there's multiple roles that need to be involved? Where it's not something that can be clearly addressed. Like, I think we don't often take the time to go off and to look at these issues and say, well, this touches on these people within the organization, and these people all need to figure out what is the best approach and how to deal with this. It's not simply a matter of going off and getting it pushed through the issue queue, but it really taking that time to think about how do we get agreement about the best approach, so that we're not excluding people or shooting ourselves in the foot by going off and implementing a solution that only one resource team decided to think about. Like, the easiest one to think about is color contrast. If the visual designer doesn't create a style guide that has accessibility in it, then that is, especially when you're looking at things like light mode and dark mode, it's more complicated to go off and create that type of visual design. But if they don't do the work of ensuring that color contrast is established early on in the process, then it's pushed down to the UX designers, who may or may not make choices about what they see as the implementation of that style guide. They may not sort of reach back to the visual designer and say, we need your input on this. We need you to go off and be involved. And if the UX people make some choices, some of which are going to be addressed when the front-end engineer goes to implement it, but there might be other issues that the front-end engineer needs to go off and be consulted with, because suddenly there's theming issues, and we have to right now in the Drupal community. There's I don't think I actually mentioned this. I'm a Drupal core accessibility maintainer, and am involved in supporting the accessibility of the Drupal communities. That's how I got into the accessibility space, is by deciding one day that I could make Drupal more accessible. And 15 years later, I'm still trying, and it is more accessible, but it's still there's still a lot more bugs to be fixed. So it's a big challenge to go off and to walk through. But yeah, how do you try and make sure that you're fixing the issues in the right area? And I was reminded of that because I was thinking about a new theme that we're implementing that will be part of core in the near future, which is the GIN theme, that has focus states established. So you can independently define the color of the focus indicator. So that means that you're giving the user the option of creating an additional accessibility barriers when they implement if a system administrator decides to pick a color combination because they like teal, and they just think teal is the best color, they throw that in as a focused color implementation, they're going to be suddenly breaking a lot of WCAG because it may not work with the front end or the back end, and there's a lot of assumptions built into that process. So anyways, there are implications that go through the chain about how do you implement things in different levels, and how do you try and help our teams work together to make sure that we're finding the best solution for our users at the end of the day. Because we want to make sure that there are no orphaned issues. We want to make sure that we're able to get that consensus and bring people together to fix issues in a reasonable amount of time, to see that we're able to build those accessible solutions that our clients are needing. A huge part of accessibility is just like, who's responsible? How do we try and see that there are things that the business understands as a priority, that we're able to go off and put that in front of other features, that the client understands that this is an issue, that we're able to build when new people are brought into our teams, that we can or when we're hiring people, if we're hiring a new designer, well, part of that job description should be, do you have skills in these areas that apply to design? Here's some accessibility issues that we're going to hold you accountable for in your performance reviews. Here's something that when it comes to your definition of done for every sprint, we're going to hold you accountable to these issues. And you're going to screw up because you're human, but this is what we're measuring you against, because we can, and because this is something that you are primarily responsible for. And again, making that clear and transparent so that they're not sort of saying, oh, well, somebody else will figure this out, or this looks great, so this is what we're going to do. It's like, no, this is a set of guidelines, a testable set of guidelines that we are going to hold you to, because this matters to us as an organization. And you can build this into your process so that it's clear that this matters to the business, and that the people know who's on first, to go off and use a Larry Curly and Moe reference. Like, it's you know who's responsible to implement these tasks, or who is needed to go off and contribute to this. So again, that we're building these. Nobody builds websites by themselves these days, not of any size, and a website of any size or complexity is managed by a team, and we need to think about development of accessibility as a team, and how are our teams responsible for that. ARRM was built for the web. How many people are web people here? Are we all? Not entirely, but some web people. All the stuff from the web content accessibility guidelines, for the most part, has been transposed to other technologies. So if you have a user interface, and in fact, even with GitHub, they're now with the text the text console. They're looking at contrast and ways to support to have better support through the console for people who have better support for disabilities, better readability. So it's not just even thinking about graphical user interfaces, but even the text console is something that is a user interface that our users are engaging with. This decision tree that I've described is something that is documented in much more detail on the web itself. But you can use that for your teams, because no matter what your product is, there's going to be a team with a designer and front end people and like there's unless you're just developing, even if you're developing an API, there's going to be documentation for that API that's going to have that information built into it. There's going to be differences about how your individual teams are splitting up the roles. Like if you're a 3-person company, you're not going to have all these roles, or you're going to be wearing multiple hats, or maybe you're going to wear a different hat for the different project you're on. But again, thinking about like this has to apply to you and your team in your specific situation, and there's different ways that are going to be useful and useful for you. So don't hold to what we have structured here as a Bible. This is a reference guide for you to go off and use to say, how do we take our teams and the way that we work and break this down so that we can have a better division of how how we can split up the responsibilities of knowing what we're responsible for delivering accessible components. And ARRM will help you go off and structure how this is dealt with and how you're managing accessibility issues in your projects. And this is there's also the phrase that if you don't with accessibility issues, if you wait later in the process to deal with accessibility, it will both be more fragile and more expensive. So if you can shift left, if you can get people to address those accessibility issues early, you're going to be able to save for the bottom line. It's something that will, like the European the European Accessibility Act has. In many cases, real implications that your companies may be held to. And again, enforcement may vary and may be different in Poland than it is in France, than it is in the Netherlands. But if you're selling to this economic bloc, you need to be thinking about the case that is the harshest, because just because you're building, most of your clients are set up in Poland, for instance, you don't want to go off and find that you're not able to sell to the Netherlands if it has a higher standard of access or higher enforcement or higher costs, higher risks to go off and to sell into the Netherlands.